I never thought moving back to my hometown would change my life in ways I couldn't imagine. When I was 18, I left for the city with big dreams and zero plans. 10 years later, after a failed startup, a messy breakup, and too many sleepless nights staring at a ceiling that didn't feel like home, I was back. The first morning, I went for a walk past my old high school. The building looked the same: red brick walls, squeaky front doors, the same crooked oak tree by the entrance. It was a Thursday, just after 8, and students were pouring in, their laughter and chatter floating in the crisp autumn air. That's when I saw her. She was standing at the entrance, clipboard in hand, directing students inside. At first glance, she could have been in her late 20s, but the way she carried herself, poised, confident, made her seem timeless. Shoulder-length dark hair framed her face, her glasses resting perfectly on a slightly tilted nose. The sunlight caught the gold chain around her neck. She wasn't trying to look young, she didn't need to. And then it hit me. I knew her. Ms. Carter. My 12th grade English teacher. The one who made Shakespeare sound like gossip, and whose voice could silence an entire class without raising a decibel. Back then, she must have been in her early 30s, still young, but far out of reach for a teenage boy with shaky self-confidence and a messy locker. She looked exactly the same. Maybe even better. I don't know why I stopped. Maybe I wanted her to see me, to notice that the awkward boy who once tripped over his words had grown into a man. Daniel, she said, tilting her head. Her voice, warm, deliberate, hit me harder than I expected. It's been a while, I managed to say. She smiled, that same slow smile she had when someone in class made a clever comment. 10 years, if I'm not mistaken. What brings you back? We exchanged a few polite lines, but there was something in her eyes, an awareness, a quiet curiosity. When the late bell rang, she excused herself, but not before saying, "You should stop by after classes. I'd love to catch up." It wasn't really an invitation. It was more like a command wrapped in silk. That afternoon, I found myself back at the school, my footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. Her classroom was exactly how I remembered: posters of classic novels, neatly stacked books, and that faint scent of paper and coffee. She was sitting at her desk, grading papers. She didn't look up immediately. "You came," she said, as if she'd known I would. I sat in the chair opposite her. "You still teaching?" Her eyes flicked up to mine. "Of course. Though, the students are different now. More distracted. Less curious." We talked for a while, slipping between small talk and deeper questions. She asked about my life in the city, my work, my relationships, each question peeling back a layer. I tried to do the same, but she was careful, revealing only what she wanted me to know. At one point, she leaned forward, elbows on the desk, studying me like I was a passage in a book she couldn't quite interpret. "You've grown into yourself," she said softly. "I can see it in your eyes." It shouldn't have made my heart race, but it did. By the time I left, the hallway was dim, the setting sun casting long shadows. She walked me to the door, her hand brushing mine for just a second, enough to spark something electric. "Come by again," she said. Maybe we'll talk about the books you never finished in my class. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about her. Not just her looks, but the way she seemed to read me without effort. The next week, I found myself back at her classroom. This time, she wasn't alone. A younger woman was leaning against her desk, laughing at something Ms. Carter had said. She was maybe mid-20s, with auburn hair tied in a loose bun, wearing a fitted blouse that made her look more like a grad student than a teacher. "Daniel," Ms. Carter said, gesturing between us. "This is Emma. She's the new art teacher." Emma extended her hand. Her grip was firm, her eyes bright. "So you're the former student she's told me about." The way she said it, half teasing, half curious, made me wonder exactly what Ms. Carter had told her. We ended up talking together for an hour, the three of us trading stories and jokes. But every so often, I'd catch Ms. Carter watching me, her expression unreadable. Emma seemed more openly curious, her gaze lingering a little too long, her smile a little too knowing. When I left that day, I realized something. I wasn't just drawn to Ms. Carter anymore. There was something between the three of us, an unspoken current. And I had no idea where it might lead. That's when everything started to shift. Over the next couple of weeks, I found myself drifting toward the school almost without thinking about it. I'd tell myself I was just going for a walk, but somehow my steps always took me past the entrance, past that crooked oak tree, and into the long, echoing hall where Ms. Carter's classroom sat. Sometimes I'd catch her alone, leaning over her desk with a pen in her hand, hair falling forward in a way that made her look far younger than her years. Other times, Emma would be there, usually perched on the edge of the desk, talking with her hands, making Ms. Carter laugh in a way that was softer, less guarded. The two of them couldn't have been more different. Ms. Carter was precise, deliberate, every movement measured. She dressed in pencil skirts and fitted blouses, heels that clicked with authority against the floor. Emma was looser, more impulsive. She wore ankle boots and skirts with uneven hems, sometimes with paint smudges on her fingers. And yet, when they were together, it was as if they existed in their own little current, pulling anyone nearby into it. One Friday afternoon, I stopped by after the final bell. The hallways were nearly empty, the kind of silence that made every footstep sound too loud. I pushed open the door to Ms. Carter's classroom and found both of them there, leaning over a table covered in art supplies. Emma glanced up first. "Daniel. We were just talking about you." My pulse picked up a beat. "All good things, I hope." "That depends," Ms. Carter said, her lips curling slightly. "Do you take compliments well?" I stepped inside, and Emma slid a chair toward me. "We're planning something," she said. "A little get-together at my place tomorrow evening. Wine, music, maybe some art. You should come." I hesitated. "Is this, like a party?" Emma shook her head. "No, nothing like that. Just the three of us." She said it casually, but the way her eyes met mine suggested she knew exactly how it sounded. Ms. Carter didn't say anything at first, just watched me. Then she added, "You might enjoy it. We could use a different perspective." The next evening, I found myself standing outside an old apartment building in the Arts District. The hallway smelled faintly of turpentine and coffee, and soft jazz drifted from somewhere above. Emma's apartment was on the top floor, the door half open, warm light spilling out into the hall. She greeted me barefoot, wearing an oversized white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, the top few buttons undone. "You made it," she said, smiling like she'd known I would. Inside, the apartment was cluttered but alive, paintings stacked against the wall, sketchbooks on the coffee table, bottles of wine lined up on the counter. Ms. Carter was already there, sitting on the couch with a glass in her hand. She wore a deep green dress that clung to her in a way that made it impossible not to notice. For a moment, I felt like I'd stepped into a different world. The first hour was easy. We drank wine, listened to music, talked about books and movies. But as the night went on, the air seemed to shift. Emma sat close, not too close, but enough that her knee brushed mine whenever she shifted. Ms. Carter stayed on the other side of the coffee table, but her gaze kept finding mine, lingering just a fraction too long. At one point, Emma stood and picked up a paintbrush from her desk. "I want to try something," she said. "Daniel, sit over there." I moved to the chair she pointed to, and she started sketching quickly, her eyes darting between me and the canvas. Ms. Carter got up too, circling behind her to watch. They spoke in low voices, occasionally glancing at me. I couldn't hear the words, but I could feel the weight of their attention. Finally, Emma stepped back. "Not finished," she said, "but it's getting there." She turned the canvas toward me. It wasn't perfect, just a rough charcoal outline, but the way she'd drawn me, it was different. Not just my face, but something in my posture, my eyes. She'd caught something I didn't even know I was showing. Ms. Carter studied it for a moment, then said, "She's right. That's you." The rest of the night blurred. We finished the wine, moved to the balcony, watched the city lights shimmer against the dark. At some point, Emma's head rested against my shoulder, and Ms. Carter sat across from us, smiling faintly like she knew exactly what she was doing. When I finally left, Emma hugged me longer than necessary, and Ms. Carter's hand brushed my arm as she said, "We'll see you again soon." It wasn't a question. That night, lying in bed, I realized something. Whatever was happening between the three of us, it wasn't going to stop at wine and conversation. It was 3 days before I saw them again. 3 days that felt longer than the 10 years I'd been away from this town. I'd been checking my phone more often than I wanted to admit, half expecting a message, but nothing came. Just when I was starting to think maybe I'd imagined the whole thing, the looks, the subtle touches, the way they seemed to be weaving me into something neither of them was explaining, I ran into Ms. Carter at the coffee shop downtown. She was alone, leaning against the counter while they prepared her drink. "Daniel," she said, with that measured tone that somehow made my name sound like a private word. I asked how she'd been. She just smiled and said, "You should come by Emma's tomorrow evening. She's got something planned." "I'll be there." She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. Emma's apartment felt different that night. The lights were lower, the music slower. A single candle flickered on the coffee table, casting long, soft shadows across the room. Emma opened the door with the kind of smile that tells you you're already part of whatever's about to happen. She wore black, this time a sleeveless top, slim pants, her hair loose and falling over one shoulder. Ms. Carter was already there, standing by the window. Her blouse was crisp white, tucked into a black skirt that ended just above the knee. She looked like she'd stepped out of a photograph, poised, calm, completely in control of the space without saying a word. We sat, drank, talked for a while. But there was something different in the air, a kind of unspoken anticipation. Emma leaned forward at one point, eyes locked on mine. "We're going to play a game," she said. "What kind of game?" I asked. Ms. Carter's voice cut in before Emma could answer. "One where you follow instructions." It wasn't a question. And the way she said it made the back of my neck prickle. Emma stood and disappeared into the other room, returning with a silk scarf. She tossed it to me. "Tie this around your wrist." I hesitated. "And if I don't?" Ms. Carter smiled, a slow, knowing smile. "Then you don't get to find out how the game ends." I tied it, the fabric cool against my skin. Emma took the other end and looped it loosely around the arm of the chair I was sitting in. It wasn't tight, I could have pulled free easily, but it didn't matter. The restraint wasn't in the knot, it was in the way they were looking at me. Emma circled behind me, her fingertips brushing my shoulders, slow and deliberate. Ms. Carter stayed in front, her eyes fixed on mine. "You trust us, don't you?" Ms. Carter asked. "I think so." "That's not an answer," she said. I swallowed. "Yes." She nodded, as if I'd just passed a test. The rest of the game was simple, or at least it should have been. They asked questions, and I had to answer honestly. Some were harmless: favorite book, first job, worst haircut. But others cut deeper: the last time I'd wanted something I couldn't have. The last time I'd thought about them. And each time I hesitated, Emma's hand would tighten briefly on my shoulder, or Ms. Carter's gaze would sharpen, reminding me who was setting the pace. By the time they were done, the scarf felt heavier than it had any right to. Emma finally untied it, but instead of stepping back, she stayed close, her hand lingering on my wrist. "Not bad," she said. "For a first try." Ms. Carter's expression was unreadable, but there was a flicker in her eyes, something between approval and calculation. We ended the night without touching anything more than we already had. But walking home, I realized my pulse was still quick, and not just from the wine. They were building something. And I was already too far in to stop it. After that night with the scarf, things changed. Not in an obvious way. They didn't suddenly call me every day or send late-night texts, but in a quieter, more deliberate rhythm. Sometimes it was Emma who reached out first, sending me a picture of something she was painting, followed by, "You should come see it in person." Sometimes it was Ms. Carter, stopping me on the street after school and saying simply, "Emma's place. 8 o'clock." It was never a request. The fourth time we met like that, I noticed how seamlessly they worked together. Emma would start something, a joke, a question, a challenge, and Ms. Carter would finish it, sometimes turning it sharper, sometimes softening it, but always keeping control over where it went. It wasn't just the two of them interacting with me. They interacted with each other just as much, often without words. A glance. A half smile. A pause that made me feel like they just had an entire conversation I wasn't privy to. And every time, I felt myself being drawn in closer. That night, Emma's apartment was even more dimly lit than before, just a string of warm lights along the ceiling. A low, slow record played in the background. I sat on the couch while Emma worked at her easel, humming to herself. Ms. Carter was beside me, her legs crossed, a glass of red wine in her hand. "Tell me," Ms. Carter said, "what do you see when you look at us?" I hesitated. "What do you mean?" "I mean," she said, tilting her head slightly, "if someone asked you to describe us, right now, what would you say?" I glanced at Emma, then back to Ms. Carter. "You're," I trailed off, trying to find the right words. "Different. But somehow, together." Emma smirked without turning from her canvas. "Not bad." Ms. Carter's lips curved just slightly. "And you? Where do you fit into that picture?" I opened my mouth, then closed it again. "I don't know yet." Emma finally stepped back from the easel, wiping her hands on a rag. "Let's find out." She moved to the couch and sat on my other side, so I was between them. Close enough that I could feel the warmth of both their bodies, smell the faint trace of perfume and paint. For a while, no one spoke. The music filled the silence, and I became acutely aware of every breath, every shift in the couch cushions. Then Emma leaned in, her lips near my ear. "Close your eyes." I did. What followed wasn't touch, not exactly, not yet. It was movement. The creak of the couch as one of them shifted. The soft brush of air near my neck. The sound of a glass being set down. The faint click of heels on the wooden floor. And then finally a fingertip grazing my jawline. I didn't know whose. The touch was slow, deliberate. It moved along my face, down my neck, then disappeared. A moment later, another touch on my knee, warmer this time, lingering just enough to make my heartbeat trip. "Don't open your eyes," Ms. Carter's voice said softly. It was the kind of tone that made following the instruction feel less like a choice and more like an inevitability. For several minutes, they moved around me like that, silent except for the occasional murmur between them, too low for me to catch. Sometimes the touch was light, almost teasing. Sometimes it was firmer, more certain. It wasn't about the touches themselves, it was about the control. I wasn't deciding when or where anything happened. They were. Finally, I felt both of them close, one on each side again. "You can open your eyes," Emma said. When I did, they were both watching me, Emma with that playful glint in her eye, Ms. Carter with a look that was harder to read, but no less intense. The rest of the night blurred in the same way it always seemed to when I was with them: wine, laughter, questions that dug deeper than I expected. But there was no mistaking it now. This wasn't two separate connections. It was one. And I was standing, or maybe sitting, right in the middle of it. It was Emma who called this time. Not a text, not an invite slipped casually into another conversation, a call. Her voice was low, almost conspiratorial. "Tonight," she said. "Bring nothing but yourself." Before I could ask, she hung up. When I arrived, the door was already unlocked. The apartment was darker than usual, only a handful of candles lit, their flames flickering against the walls. The music was slower, heavier. Emma was by the window, barefoot, wearing a long black slip that looked like it might slide off her shoulder if she breathed too deeply. Ms. Carter stood near the couch, in a fitted navy dress, her hair pinned back, revealing the sharp line of her jaw. Neither of them said hello. Emma walked toward me first, stopping just close enough that I could feel her warmth. She studied me for a moment, her head tilted, like she was checking for something invisible. Then she stepped aside. Ms. Carter took her place. Her eyes locked on mine, steady and unblinking. "You've been wondering where this is going," she said. It wasn't a question. I swallowed. "Yes." She stepped closer. "We'll show you. But only if you're willing to let go of control." The words sat between us, heavy. I glanced at Emma. She was watching intently, her expression unreadable. "I'm willing," I said. "Good," Ms. Carter replied. Emma moved then, circling behind me. I felt her fingers brush lightly against my back, a whisper of contact that sent a shiver up my spine. Ms. Carter stayed in front, her gaze holding me in place without needing to touch me at all. "This isn't about what you want in the moment," Ms. Carter said. "It's about trust. About letting us decide what you need." Emma's voice came from behind me, low and teasing. "And maybe surprising you along the way." What followed felt less like an evening and more like a carefully orchestrated performance, one where I wasn't the audience, but part of the act. They moved around me in turns, sometimes together, sometimes separately. A brush of fingertips here, a pause so long it felt deliberate. Every action seemed to have been decided before I arrived. There was no rush, in fact, the slowness was the point. They wanted me to feel every second, to stay suspended in that uncertain space where I didn't know what would happen next. At one point, Emma tied the same silk scarf loosely around my wrist, the one from before, but this time she let the other end dangle freely. Ms. Carter took the end, wrapping it once around her own wrist before letting it go again, as if to remind me how easily she could take control if she wanted to. "Still willing?" she asked. I nodded. Emma's laugh was quiet, almost approving. "He learns fast." The night built slowly towards something unspoken, not a single moment, but a series of them. Emma's hand resting on my chest, her eyes locking with mine just long enough to make my pulse jump. Ms. Carter leaning in close enough that I could feel her breath against my ear as she told me exactly where to look, and exactly when to close my eyes. By the time it was over, I wasn't sure if hours had passed or minutes. All I knew was that I'd stepped out onto a different edge, one I couldn't see before, and one I had no intention of backing away from. When I left, they didn't walk me to the door this time. Emma stayed curled up on the couch, watching me with that sly, knowing smile. Ms. Carter simply said, "We'll call you." And I knew they would. Epilogue. People talk about relationships like they're lines between 2 points, straight, simple, predictable. But some aren't lines at all. Their shapes. Their entire constellations, drawing themselves in ways you can't see until you're inside them. And once you are, you stop worrying about where they lead. You just follow.